Now, a lot of people, when they practice bass, practice with an amp, and that is totally okay. There's nothing wrong with practicing with an amp or anything of the sort. But personally, I do prefer practice without an amp, and I want to go into the reasons why in today's video, because I do think there are lots of benefits which come from practicing without an amp, apart from just it sounds a lot quieter. Now, the first thing I want to go through today is the fact that it does sound quieter. That is the first sort of main advantage people will see. You're not making loud noises in the middle of the night or whenever you choose to practice. The bass is a very, very quiet instrument, and you're just making a very limited amount of noise that only you can really hear and no one else can. While it's great to practice with an amp and get that sort of amp sound, I personally only practice with an amp, quote unquote practice, when I'm at a gig. When I'm at home, I never practice with an amp. If I'm playing with other people, then yeah, I will have an amp. But if I'm just by myself, I basically always go acoustic and just the acoustic sounds of the bass. But why is this actually an advantage? And the main reason for it is you can really develop good bass tone if you play acoustically. Let's say, for example, I'll give this one because it's perhaps a bit more obvious to see. If you play the saxophone, but you play a digital saxophone all the time that goes through a digital thing, then you get the stuff under your fingers, but you don't actually develop the saxophone tone because, you know, you just blow into it and the machine does the work there. Whereas on an actual saxophone, there's loads of other embouchure things that you have to do to get good tone. The same sort of goes with bass. If you plug into an amp and you get your fingers round, you can get the notes out, but your tone may perhaps suffer. And it's always great if you're sounding good acoustically, you're probably going to sound good through an amp as well. And it's great to build that tone acoustically, as if the bass actually sounds nice to you acoustically. If like you're barely getting a sound out of it, or it just sounds really tinny and rackety and just not what you want out of the sound, then you know you need to improve it perhaps. And if it sounds great when it comes through an amp, if you're digging in really hard and it doesn't sound great when you're playing acoustically because all you can hear is the strings flapping, fine, that is of a certain style. But especially for jazz music, I'm barely playing anything when I'm going through this, and obviously I can't show you it acoustically in this video because you're not in the room with me. So it is plugged in, not to an amplifier, just to an audio interface that just goes directly in, so you can just hear my natural bass tone. For the case of this video, it just directly goes in. It's the sound that you get ambiently in the room basically, but you know, it just filters out all that sort of slight room noise and perhaps some other noise that happens on the bass, like you sliding over the strings and whatnot. You'll just hear the note, but you won't actually hear the sliding noise. At least you shouldn't hear the sliding noise, but you might at the end of the day. We'll see what happens when I edit through this video. But you can get a much better understanding and further develop your tone with the use of practicing without an amplifier. If you also don't use an amplifier, you can develop better technique, as with good tone comes good technique after all, unless you're someone like Pino Palladino, who's got frankly awful technique, but it works for him and he sounds good. So there's nothing wrong with that per se, but perhaps just not the norm for most people. But if you can get good sounding bass notes out, or if you can't get good bass sounding notes rather out of the acoustic stuff, you know, there's technique issues. It can really pinpoint some technique issues which you have, like if you're not being consistent here, or perhaps you're playing too close or too far away from the fret, or you're playing over the fret on a fretted bass, because you're most likely on that. A lot of issues with this fretting hand, but perhaps some issues with this as well. It's easier to hear string muting though, and get better string muting technique with an amp, as you can really hear when those strings ring out rather than acoustically. But you can still look at them and see if they're moving, even if potentially you can't hear them. If you see strings moving, you look at them but you can't hear them. When you plug it through an amp, you will hear it. But for things sort of mechanically on the front of the fretboard or whatever, positioning on the fret, well, will come through on an amp. It's great to get that right acoustically as well. Essentially, if you think about it as a whole, you've got this sound concept which you want as a bass player, which you gain from listening to loads of other great players and, you know, listening to recordings and whatnot of just great stuff, and you see bass players online doing things, and you build your own sort of thing from that as well. But I find if you don't practice without an amp at points, things like your tone will suffer, and in part your technique will suffer because it won't accommodate for that better tone. And you can sort of get that thing that perhaps you weren't quite getting if you start practicing acoustically. It really is just a great advantage of hearing the natural sound of the bass and getting used to the natural sound of the bass as well, as it is a really nice sound. It sort of sounds a little bit acoustically, like acoustic bass perhaps, not acoustically, whatever that's supposed to mean, but it sort of sounds a bit more acoustic bassy, especially on this fretless, just, you know, a lot quieter than an acoustic bass would be, because obviously it doesn't have the massive resonating chamber. Although if you practice and you feel like it's perhaps too quiet, if you lean your bass up against a desk or something, then it will resonate more and it will sound a lot louder as well. But the low notes you'll perhaps hear a lot less of when you're playing acoustically than the higher stuff, as you know, perhaps they don't travel as well when they're coming from a speaker if they're right in front of you. But there's just great advantages for your tone development if you practice acoustically, and of course it's way quieter than practicing through an amp unless you put headphones in. But I do find when I put headphones in, it's just like a bit like meh. I prefer just to get the sound of the room as well, as when you're at a gig you're not just going to have headphones in. Well, you may have ear things to, you know, give you sound or sort of backings or time for the whatever show you're doing. In most cases you'll just be playing acoustically in the room and getting used to that, and playing something out of your speakers and then playing acoustically. So have your speakers on low and then playing some stuff acoustically. Great for playing off backing tracks, and you can really develop your tone. Get good at dynamics as well. You can build those dynamics further. Acoustically, you've got to be really, really careful with your dynamics, because you know, if you're not loud enough, then you need to get louder. If at some extent you're really going for it and you still can't hear yourself, your speakers are too loud, you need to get that fine balance. But then you can really practice your acoustics in there, and that is one of the greatest things you can do as a bass player, is practice getting quieter and louder and etc., and going through all of that, because it's something a lot of bass players miss actually, and getting that gauge of playing quietly all the way down here and then really digging in and all of that. And it may sound simple as a concept, but people don't do it enough. And then adjusting your hand position along here, it will make less difference acoustically than through an amp, but it still does make a difference acoustically. It will be a bit quieter if you play over the fingerboard than over the pickups, and especially back by the bridge here, because you'll get a lot more top end through the sound. You'll be able to hear loads of difference because obviously it's being amplified direct in through these pickups, whereas acoustically the strings are just vibrating, making the noise, and that's what you're hearing. Now in bass tutorials and general things, we do a lot with this hand over here, the one that does all the fretting, all the notes, and we work on all the hand positions and just making sure that we've got this hand in check. But often this one over here gets forgotten about, and bass picking is a thing which takes time to master and get good at. So I'm going to take you through the steps on how to get this hand playing up to scratch and become a master at your bass picking. So let's get into it. Now it can seem a really odd concept, and also by looking at people doing this bass picking, it may look like something else, and you may think it's something else as well. Like a lot of people who don't play saxophone think the reed goes on the top rather than on the bottom. I've just seen it a lot, okay? It's a common misconception. With bass, there's a common thing where beginners will pluck the strings, pull the strings up when they try this technique, because that's what they think. Yeah, you pluck it like, you know, you pluck it with a pick. You pull up, you use your fingers like you would a pick. And, you know, for a pick, that's not really what a pick's actually doing. Where you're doing that plucking motion, the pick is just pressing into the string and pressing through the string. And that's ultimately what you want to do with your hand, is press the string through. You can see here, or you should be able to hear, that I'm not plucking. That's what plucking and picking sounds like. You can see how it's a bit sort of harsher. If I press through, I know it sounds similar, but you can see how my hand position has to change for that to work, and how I'm way less consistent. I can't I can't get my bass plucking consistent like I'm doing there if I'm plucking the strings up, and it gets worse on higher strings. So, you know, you press the string down, and what I mean by press isn't like just push it down like it's a button, but it's sort of press through it. So if you've got your thumb here, hopefully you've got it grounded on a pickup of some sort. Let's just focus on the E string for the time being. So if we're playing the E, ground it on any sort of pickup you want. I don't want it over here or here or here or whatnot. I want it on top of the pickup. Now, your bass might not have this pickup because most of you probably don't have stingrays. But just find this like little black box coming out of your bass. You know what your pickups are probably, but if you don't, there's these little things that come out, and you should be able to rest your thumb on the top of them. If you're playing the E string, rest your thumb there, ground it, keep it pretty straight. Don't really bend it or curve it, keep it pretty straight, and then this hand comes over sort of like that sort of shape. Yes, the wrist angle is a bit steep, perhaps it's less steep when you have it. Mine's a bit like that, sort of drapes over this part of the bass. This part's deliberately shaped so you can put your hand here pretty comfortably, and then yeah, get your finger in, thumb sort of not directly parallel to it, sort of like your thumb isn't just right on the back. I sort of got it angled to the side slightly, sort of a 45-degree angle with my thumb facing towards the bass there. And then I'm pressing through the string into my thumb rather than any other part of me. I'm pressing through into my thumb. This first finger goes straight into the top of my thumb, and the second finger sort of comes around the side, and they're the different, you know, ways my fingers land there. You can use 3, but for today we're just focusing on 2, and it alternating going, you know, first, second, first, second, first, second, first, second, first, second. And ultimately you're going to need to do a lot of just playing an open string and just getting used to that bass plucking technique. Essentially, you should be able to talk, have conversation through it, and keep that consistent as well. In the sort of early days, you'll struggle to, you know, keep it all reasonably consistent, and you'll want a metronome for this, and start slower tempos. Don't immediately just absolutely rapid fire go all over the strings like that. No, start like really slow like this, and just go through it and keep going and get a metronome going and start doing that. Of course, I haven't got a metronome on at the moment, so that probably wasn't perfectly in time, but do that and then you can do it. Remember, first, second, but you always want this on beat 1. If it's an upbeat in a bar, you start on your second finger. If it's a quick note before, and 1 and 1. So that's going second, first, and 1 and 1 and 1, because this one sort of should be weaker as such. Like, this is for the stronger beats, and then this second finger, your middle finger, is for all the weaker beats in the bar, essentially, because it's a 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and so it's the ands if you're playing quavers, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and then, you know, for 16ths it's different again, but it's all the sort of offbeats that go on that aren't on the 1 2 3 4, because that's what you do in this hand. 2 3 4, 1 2 3 4, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and you just add that second finger in essentially, and really press the string. Don't pluck the string. That's the main thing, which I say you'll find you get a much better tone, and you won't be really hurting your fingers as much as you would be. You will get blisters and things like that, and I still get blisters from time to time, especially if I've taken a little break for a bit perhaps. But, you know, it's a sign of your good effort and your good work. But, you know, just don't pull up the strings, don't pluck the strings, don't just do all that. Just press the string through into your thumb lightly and delicately. I'm barely putting any pressure on the strings as I'm doing this, because often playing lightly is the best way to do things. But there's one more thing which I'm going to talk about with this hand, because it's got one more job to do. And it's, what if you want to play some other strings? If you want to play anything on the E string, fine, you can sound the pickup, but I can't reach all the way over to the G string. There's another issue which I often find. People stick to a position and are grounded to it, and then don't move their thumb at all, and they like bend their hand over like this. This is not what you want to do, and you need to actively think about this when you start doing it. Once you know, if I just play something, it's second nature. You can probably see, look, my fingers going down as I go towards the G string, and then it goes back to the pickup, and all it's doing is gliding across and back down. And you know, it goes all the way up to the D string. Sometimes my thumb's on the D string. Sorry, I didn't mean to bring out my G there. So it's on the D string, the A string, the E string, or the pickup. And you've got to actively think to yourself what string you're on demands what. And my general rule really is whatever string you want, you sort of go one step down from it. Although usually, if I'm playing the G, I'll usually be on the A. Sometimes I go down to the D, you can think of it. If you're on the E string, have your finger on the pickup. If you're playing the A string, have your finger on the E string. If you're playing the D string, finger on the A string. You can keep your finger on the A string for the G string, but you can go to the D string as well for that G string. And if you can just glide your finger up and down, and you can see my thumb's moving from all these positions and it's gliding in between, and then that's how my finger's moving, because that's how you get the dexterity to go, you know, whatever you want over the fingerboard essentially, and you can do all of that sort of stuff. But you do need to focus on one thing with your thumb once you're past the E string. If you're on your E string, it's fine, and for muting, you're keeping it muted. But if you're on the A, make sure your thumb's resting on the E, because it's going to keep that muted. And for the D, my thumb is resting on the A and the E strings to stop them from ringing out, because it is another issue. And if you want cleaner tone, you've got to make sure you're blocking those strings. My thumb is simply just resting sort of sideways, just on the strings, and then I'm picking it, and only that string is ringing out. I'm not putting pressure on the strings, I'm just as lightly as just resting my hand on them. I don't want to be pressing in, digging in, doing all sorts of things. That's going to scuff up the side of your thumb here. So don't do that, just gently on the side is enough. So that's my tips for bass plucking technique mastering. If you remember, press the strings and you know to move your thumb when you go up and down the strings, and you get that down, you are a master already at doing all this stuff, as well as the consistent picking technique. Then you've got it essentially, and then you can bass pick technique. So build it up over time, because it does take time, and hopefully this has taught you something, and now you know where you're going when you're doing your next bass tune, and you can start incorporating some proper bass plucking rather than using a pick if you're doing that at the moment, or some incorrect plucking. So that's it for today's video. I'll see you all in the next one. Bye.